good afternoon, or good morning, everyone. We are pretty much from all over the world and from every time zones. My name is Esther Simon. I'm a senior lecturer in international relations at Nottingham Trent University in the UK, and I'm co-hosting this event with David Wilcox of the University of Birmingham, who will handle your questions during the question and answer period. Today's event is co-organized by the Trust Research in International Relations Research Group, which we also co-lead on with David. And if anybody is interested in joining us, please feel free to email David or me after this session. David, if you wouldn't mind sharing our email addresses in the chat so that everybody can see them. Thank you. This event is planned to be 90 minutes long. It will start with a panel discussion, and then we will take questions at the end. You may post your questions and comments in the chat from this point on any time. Please make sure that the questions are short and sweet, and please be clear who you want whom you want to answer the question. You can direct the question at a panelist or to the whole panel. We have a wonderful lineup of speakers who all have made major contributions to international relations trust scholarship. Emeritus Professor Deborah Larson from the University of California, Los Angeles is the first panelist I'd like to introduce. Second, Professor Andrew Kidd is here from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Professor Nicholas Wheeler is representing the University of Birmingham in the UK, and Vincent Keating, last but not least, Vincent Keating is an associate professor at the University of Southern Denmark in Denmark. So we have come together today to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the publication of Andrew Kidd's book, Trust and Mistrust in International Relations. And we would also like to use this occasion to reflect on current events, as a fundamental shift seems to be happening in global relations, with the post-war international order seemingly unraveling before our eyes. As Vincent just said before we started the live session, it's usually just bad news. So long-standing alliances are no longer guaranteed, and confrontational diplomacy has replaced traditional diplomatic civility. And these developments seem to provide interesting challenges for trust, which we are going to discuss today. My first question would be about Andrew Kidd's book. And this question is a little bit different from the rest, because I have a different question for Andrew than for the rest of the panelists. So Andrew, I'd like to ask you to reflect back on what were your motivations for writing Trust and Mistrust in International Relations, and for developing a rational calculation-based argument for trust in IR, and how relevant do you see this approach in light of current events? For the rest of the panelists, my question is, how do you see the importance of Andrew Kidd's book for the discipline of international relations and for your research? Andrew, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks, Esther. Thanks very much. Thanks to you and to David for organizing it, and to Debbie and Vincent and Nick for coming and participating on the roundtable. It's a great honor. And thanks to everybody for coming. So in response to the two questions, in terms of motivations, so at the sort of intellectual level, leaving aside the more pragmatic publication decisions, which I could talk about for the junior faculty if people want to talk about articles versus books and how to think about where you should allocate your effort. But in terms of the intellectual motivation, it was twofold, I would say. Number one, it's sprung out of dissatisfaction with the state of existing international relations theory at the time. In particular, Waltzian realism, to my mind, did not really adequately understand the necessity to consider beliefs about motivations. And that's understandable. It makes theory simple if you don't do that. But it struck me as necessary to really understand international relations. And I was in graduate school in the late 80s, early 90s. So the collapse of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union were big issues at that time. It just struck me as improbable that you could really grapple with these sorts of events with a structural model that assumed that all states have the same motivation and that states don't worry about each other's motivations, think about each other's motivations, et cetera. And so I thought there's a problem with this sort of structural theory that Waltz was purveying in his 79 book, and that people like John Mearsheimer, who's at University of Chicago, where I was a student, continued to be endorsing through his 2000 book, in this reluctance to think about intentions as a fundamental element of realist theory. And it became clear to me in some other work that came out in article form before this, that if you did have actually a world of security-seeking states who knew each other to be security-seeking states, then you really wouldn't have a security dilemma. You wouldn't have a problem because they would know each other's motivations, trust each other's motivations, and would be able to cooperate, regardless of relative power, changes in relative power, all the sorts of things that realists like to focus on. And one source of theory that I thought out there that did cover this was Bob Jervis's analysis of the security dilemma and the spiral model. And that, I thought, really did a good job at the sort of verbal level of analyzing these questions, or at least starting to analyze these questions. But it wasn't fully integrated with structural realism and the Waltzian framework at the time. It was sort of presented as this alternative thing. Whereas it struck me that it's not actually an alternative thing. It's like, it's the thing. It's like it's what Waltzian realism ought to be. It should be kind of foundational. So I thought you needed a foundation, a sort of a synthesis of structural realism and the security dilemma spiral model perspective in one framework. And that was the ambition of the book and all the stuff I was working on at that time, to try to make that synthesis. And to do it at a formal level, because so this was, I mean, I came into the discipline in the late 80s again, and Bob Axelrod's work had become influential, and in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, the whole crisis bargaining framework had become popular. And so game theory was making really big inroads, and I think clarifying a lot of issues in international relations theory. And so I wanted to fully develop that and present a sort of a rigorous version of what I thought structural realism / the spiral model, ought to be in theory. So that was the goal. And so then the next question is it still relevant? And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's still relevant, obviously, I guess. I think we see a lot of volatility in US motivations right now, and that's leading to massive decreases in trust for the United States. And so I think the theory is sort of borne out in that sense, and that's having potentially large-scale structural effects on what the international system is going to look like. If we no longer have a good relationship with Canada because we're contemplating attacking it and conquering it, that's a sea change. It's brought about by domestic politics, and it's an enormous decline in international trust in a relationship that we used to take for granted, all because of this change in American preferences. So to my mind, it's as relevant as it ever was. I mean, it's one thing I slightly regret about the book, the way I wrote it, was I had a brief concluding chapter where I, in 2005, looked into the future and worried about decline in trust for the United States in the wake of the Iraq War in 2003. And that was a time when a lot of countries were skeptical of American motivations. Trust declined because it seemed like we justified this war with reference to weapons of mass destruction, but then we didn't find any. And so a lot of people were very skeptical about US motivations at that point. And I was trying to extrapolate from that and say, the United States, in the context of the chapters 5 and 6, then I talk about the trustworthy hegemon, right? The United States should be a trustworthy hegemon here, and it's in danger of not being so. And that now seems like kind of almost naive in retrospect, and certainly dates the book in a way that I wish I had not done. I wish I just ended it with the end of the Cold War, and then it would have had no sort of, nothing that dated it. One thing I love actually about, say, Frederick Clay's book, Every War Must End, is that it's a book about war ending written during the Vietnam War that never mentions Vietnam. And so it lasts forever, right? It will never go out of date because it's not topical. So that's one word of advice for people. Make sure your books last forever. Don't have a concluding chapter about current events.
Okay, thank you for that advice. Deborah, how would you see the relevance of Andy's book for IR today and for your own research?
Well, I think I'll talk later about current events, but right now I just want to talk about why I think the book was a major contribution for several reasons. And my perspective is a little bit different from Andy's on why I think it was important, because there had been a lot of previous work on the importance of beliefs and perceptions. But I think what made Andy's book unique at the time was the combination of formal methods with this the question of beliefs and perceptions and how they could lead to trust and cooperation. And so I would say that the book was important for three reasons. One is that it formalized and developed a previous intuition among game theorists that costly signals could lead to cooperation. And then second, it showed that trust and mistrust could both be rational and could be modeled rigorously, that they weren't just fuzzy psychological concepts. And the third reason is that the book combined formal models with historical case studies, in-depth historical case studies, not just examples. And a previous work on game theory would just have, like a little, hypothetical example or something like that, but it didn't really try to apply it to the real world. And the case studies were important ones: the origins of the Cold War, US leadership of Western Europe, and the end of the Cold War. Now, in terms of my own research, I think the book was important because it showed that trust could be rational and that we need to think about how to make it so.
Thank you. Nick, what's your take on the importance of Andy's book for the discipline and for your research?
Thanks, and really interesting to hear Andy's kind of sense of what he was trying to do, and very much endorse what Debbie's saying as well about the importance of the book. Just very quickly, thanks to Esther and Dave and ISA for bringing us all together, and great to see so many people on the call. Really looking forward to this discussion. So look, it's a great pleasure to be here with Andy, someone who's become a friend over our time together in this journey of trust, but also someone who, in my view, in trust and mistrust in international relations, produced a major contribution to thinking about trust in international relations. And it was interesting, Andy, the way you framed it. You didn't really put trust at the kind of center of it. And I think it's an interesting way of sort of how people read the book and what they take from the book as a kind of really pivotal sort of contribution. But I very much take what you said about what you were doing and everything. And I think what was really important for me about the book is that you brought trust and the security dilemma into conversation with one another. And I think that using Bob Jervis's spiral model as your kind of vehicle for doing that, I think is a really interesting way of kind of framing kind of what you were doing. I think the book, along with yours, Debbie, the 1997 book, Anatomy of Mistrust, I think they're the two pioneering books in the development of trust research in international relations. When the story of trust research in international relations is told by the generations to follow, your two books are going to be the two that are going to be the ones that really set the discipline up, set the subfield up. And I think it's great that we're here today, Andy, to mark the 20th anniversary of your book. I think, as Esther implied in her opening, it's the go-to book if you want to explore and understand and engage a rational choice game theoretic approach to trust in international relations. It's the standard work for any student, any researcher that wants to understand the calculative or rationalist approach to trust. And I think, the fact we're here 20 years later, marking its 20th birthday is you know, a testimony and a tribute to what you achieved. And as I say, for me, it was really important in terms of thinking about how the security dilemma and trust could be brought together. So I was working on the book with Ken Booth at the time that became the Security Dilemma book that we published in 2008. And I think the way that you set up the tools for thinking about that relationship between trust and the security dilemma was a really powerful and important one. Bringing the assurance game, prisoner's dilemma framing to the discussion about how the possibilities of cooperation, I think was a really compelling contribution. You can't think about trust building, it seems to me, under anarchy in this way of framing international relations without falling back onto those things. And you very much sort of talking that way as you kind of, in my view, as you explained kind of what you were trying to do in the book. And I think, you know, the other thing that was really important for me is that you're among the first theorists, if not the first, to explore the relationship between trust and reassurance in a systematic manner in the way that you do. And I think, you know, as Debbie said, you know, costly signaling, you know, is one of the key mechanisms that defensive realism argues can build cooperation under the security dilemma. But your book is the first account, as far as I'm aware, that seeks to show how the sending of costly signals depends upon a certain baseline of trust. So bringing trust and costly signals into conversation with one another, bringing trust and the security dilemma into conversation with one another, these are pioneering contributions and importance of the book. And I think, you know, the big claim that you make on page 201 of the book, that costly signaling will permit reassurance and cooperation between rational security seekers, no matter how mistrustful they are of each other to begin with, I think that remains a really powerful takeaway from the book. Whether you agree or disagree with that, it's a very powerful, bold argument that you make. Thanks.
Thank you, Nick. Vincent, what is your take on the importance of Andy's book for IR and for your own research?
Yeah, thanks, Esther. So I have the benefit of going last, so I can say that I agree, of course, with everybody who came before. One of the great things about a panel like this is that you get to re-explore. Here's the book for people who are wondering what it looks like. You get to re-explore something that I hadn't actually read, you know, cover to cover in quite a few years. But it's safe to say that it is, you know, when I got engaged in trust research with actually Nick and Jan Ruzicka back in, I think it was 2007, this was one of the first things that we read, actually along with Deborah's book as well. And so I guess that really says everything in terms of the importance. I think I've cited it in basically every paper I've written on trust, you know, as kind of just a fundamental way to think about it. And I think because a lot of people have talked about its academic impact, I also wanted to think about also how I found it really pedagogically useful to teach trust. So I think that even throwing something at the students that what trust is, in the case of Andrew saying that it's a belief that the other side prefers mutual cooperation to exploiting one's own cooperation, and then mistrust is the opposite, kind of gets them to start thinking about, okay, so what exactly are we talking about when we talk about trust? I think the basic concepts that he introduces, especially of a cooperative equilibrium, a non-cooperative equilibrium, the role of costly signals to establish trust, are very pedagogical for the students to get kind of the basics of trust in IR, particularly you know, the role of game theory in the prisoner's dilemma and the assurance game. And then lastly, and I think the big takeaway is exactly moving trust away from expected behavior to, as Andrew said, underlying motivations, and getting the students to think about how it is that we might know underlying motivations. And of course, the fact that it's in a way immensely quotable. I mean, one of the quotes I always give to my students is that Hitler might think Britain the most trustworthy state in the world, and yet realize that the likelihood that Churchill will cooperate with him is zero, right? In terms of thinking about the importance of underlying motivations. And I think, although I understand Andrew's position in how he ended the book, you know, and whether or not that dates it a little, I think what's very important is that the overall research still really, research problem, sorry, really resonates today. namely that states that trust each other sufficiently cooperate, states that do not may end up in conflict. And that's certainly something I think we're going to be discussing today.
Thank you, Vincent. So my next couple of questions, maybe next two questions, because we won't have time for a couple of questions. But my next questions will be about current events, and I let you pick which current events you want to talk about. So how are current events reshaping trust between nations and their leaders? Andrew, what would be your take on this?
So the biggest one, sort of the most obvious one maybe, is the relationship between the United States and our allies, Canada, Europe, and further afield. So that's what chapters 5 and 6 are all about. And I have this model of essentially multilateral cooperation where you can have asymmetry. So one player can be stronger than the others, and you have geography. And so states care about each other differentially. But the overall concept is it's kind of like a tipping game in the sense that the more people are going to, if they're benignly motivated, the more people who think that others are going to cooperate in this joint project, in this case, defense against the Soviets, the more they want to, and the more they're willing to participate in that. And in that case, you need a strong and trustworthy hegemon to get you close to that tipping point. And if people believe that's going to happen, that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. I was arguing that in the case of the beginning of the Cold War, you saw that sort of behavior on the part of the Europeans who were trying to bring in the United States and keep us involved in European politics, and that all worked in large part because of beliefs about underlying motivations. And that we're kind of throwing that away at this point. So we've had so much volatility in American preferences. We have a new president who has a very different view of American alliances in general, views alliance partners as free riders, has this kind of public good perspective, but not a tipping model perspective that the United States is being taken advantage of. We are being played for suckers, defending other countries who are rich enough to defend themselves, running trade deficits with countries that ought to be, we ought to be running surpluses with, et cetera. And that all was sort of apparent in Trump's worldview, even back to the 80s, but now it's gone even farther with all this loose talk about invading Greenland, invading Canada. So what you have is someone whose motivations are at best unknown and at worst, arguably, self-evidently malign from the perspective of our traditional allies. And so we've just lost all that trust from other countries. It hasn't really, an interesting aspect of it is that a lot of it is so far still kind of the level of verbal communications. It hasn't really, nothing has happened yet, except for Ukraine in terms of decline of aid to Ukraine. But the verbal statements alone have already succeeded in weakening and undermining trust between the United States and other countries. So I think that's kind of the main thing. I can amplify on that, but in the interest of time, I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Deborah?
As a broad overview, President Trump has taken a wrecking ball to the liberal international order by undermining trust in U.S. security guarantees and U.S. economic reliability. In psychology, trust is defined as reliance on the other at the risk of a bad outcome. President Trump's statements that he won't defend U.S. NATO allies unless they, quote, pay up, unquote, and his recent actions, like his reluctance to support Ukraine in the war against Russian aggression, have ruptured U.S. allies' trust in the United States. And here I would disagree with Andrew's approach somewhat in that I don't tend to see beliefs as stable, that they tend to fluctuate in inferences. And so you can't just have a starting point where everybody has a certain belief and then you'll have a certain outcome, because beliefs change. In terms of economic policy making, because of his impulsiveness and his irrational and erratic tariff policy, no one can trust what Trump is going to do in the economic realm. The tariffs go up and down day by day. Nobody knows if they're going to be here 6 months from now, 3 months from now, day by day. So overall, mistrust of U.S. intentions and motives is growing day by day, as U.S. allies and friends can no longer rely on the United States.
Thank you. Nick?
Yeah, so I'd like to step back, if I may, and Debbie just used the word mistrust, and I think if we're going to understand the sort of the current condition in terms of thinking about trust in a turbulent world, the concept that we need to leverage and think about is the concept of distrust. And I think there's a fundamental difference between mistrust and distrust. So I think if we mistrust, then we're uncertain about the intentions of others. We neither trust nor we distrust. But if we distrust, then we have an active belief that another party can't be trusted. And I think the crisis of trust in contemporary international relations is that we're facing a world in which distrust is becoming more and more predominant. And that actually poses a real challenge, because if we're trying to think about, and I don't want to prejudge your next question, Esther, too much, but if we're thinking about how we can restore trust or maintain trust, if we're actually in relationships of distrust, then the real challenge is to actually try and think about how we can reduce distrust. And I think, and this is kind of ongoing research that I'm involved in, we're trying to think about the challenge of how to reduce distrust, because without reducing distrust, you can't actually build trust. And I think the question we're kind of posed with is, to what extent then today relationships between the major actors, and in particular the work I do is in the nuclear space, to what extent those actors are actually in relationships which are, spiral model relationships where the conflict is actually driven by misperceptions and misunderstandings. And if only we could properly communicate our intentions, we could move to cooperation. Or actually, using your framing, Andy, are we dealing with actors who are increasingly dominated by prisoner's dilemma preferences, where even if they have assurances that others will cooperate, they're still going to exploit? And if that's the world in which we're in, if increasingly the major states are viewing their relationships with each other in terms of prisoner's dilemma preferences, then distrust is going to be the dominant vocabulary in which state leaders interact with one another, and in which international relations is kind of carried through. And we can see that if we look at, if I pick on the example of Ukraine, and you think about Putin, the way Putin's been using and manipulating nuclear brinkmanship to try to pursue his goals in Ukraine is, I think, a really good example of a leader operating with very strong prisoner's dilemma preferences. So the question about how we think about the possibilities of reshaping relations in a way that maintains and promotes trust is actually, for me, a question about how we replace distrust. And that's something, Andy, you wrote very interestingly about in 2018 when we had that forum, when you talked about the real challenge being to reduce deep distrust to moderate distrust and then neutrality. And I think that's a really interesting way of kind of framing the contemporary predicament. Thanks.
Thank you, Nick. Vincent?
Yeah, thanks. I think I'm going to come at it from a point of view of thinking about the normativity of trust, and especially the normativity of trust amidst what I'm going to call the ideological fragmentation of the world. Because I think for me, this is, for me, the idea of trust is essentially a normative idea. What we trust in has to be some sort of normative principle. And we, of course, then trust others to have a successful performance of that, whatever that normative principle is. And trust is, for me, again, fundamentally a relationship in this respect. And so if this is how we think about trust, what I see is a problem of how it is that the ideological fragmentation of the world basically creates more uncertainty over underlying motivations of the other, whoever that is, and you can take any pairwise or group combination that you want. And to a certain extent, right? I mean, the problem is that we might not have the same expectations that other states will behave in a, for us, trustworthy way, again, given our normative preferences, seeing that we see that they think differently. And therefore they might be untrustworthy, again, from our normative vantage point. I think there's possibly a problem that perhaps if there's certain types of differences, particularly differences, normative differences that we may believe to be somewhat fundamental, there's always a danger that we then overgeneralize these differences and maybe say that this isn't just about this specific area, but in fact their general trustworthiness is then put into question because of the way that they seem to act oppositionally to what we see as very well-established normative values that we hold. And part of the problem might actually be maybe not so much, these disputes in reality, but whether or not we actually have a little bit of a failure, and I'll speak from a liberal point of view right now, and I'll define liberal very broadly to, just for the sake of argument, a failure of imaginaries to kind of keep up with this global ideological transition, which again, for us, kind of only increases our perception of the uncertainty that's out there, which then makes us a little bit anxious about, where trust is in the world. And I think that this is potentially a problem, right? Is that, it's not simply that actors, in global actors seem to have different preferences than us, which of course then affects whether we believe them to be trustworthy overall, but that sometimes we tend to treat our ideological adversaries, and here I'm quoting Rebecca Adler-Neeson, as illegitimate, irrational, or indeed deviant. And how it is that this might even make the trustworthiness problem even worse, because now we're talking about another actor for whom the normative position isn't just different, but they are now intrinsically alien to us and ununderstandable in some way. And so that's how I'm thinking about it.
Thank you, Vincent. Before I ask my next question, I would like to encourage our audience to post their questions in the chat if they have any, because we are going to take a couple of them towards the end, or maybe third part of the session. So my next question would be, assuming that this era of bad news eventually comes to an end, how can trust first endure in an era of diplomatic turbulence that we see today, and how much can it be restored in the future? Andrew?
Sure, I'll just make 2 points. Number one, I would say, even in the current era, it's not like trust is irrelevant or all hope is lost in some sense, because the very sort of decline or stepping back of the United States from being a trustworthy hegemon, trustworthy actor, may throw into brighter relief the trustworthiness of other actors. And so I think the big question here is, can the Europeans keep it together in the absence of US leadership, or even in the presence potentially of somewhat malign US leadership in terms of connections with Russia? Can the Europeans keep it together in the EU, possibly in NATO with a absent United States? What will happen to Canada? Can Canada join the EU? Will the border between Canada and the United States become a NATO frontier of some sense? So I think there's a lot of interesting questions to be talked about in terms of what's going to happen with Europeans and Canada. I'm reminded of Bob Keohane's book back in 1984 or 5 or thereabouts, After Hegemony, which was quite premature at that point, but is increasingly, although in the economic sphere, I guess he had the point, but in the security sphere, it was a bit early. But now maybe worth returning to in many ways. So the trust relationships between non-US partners could be quite interesting. Can it be restored? I think only through the electoral cycle in the United States, right? If the United States rejects Trump at some point or rejects Trumpism, I mean, nominally he's a lame duck president at this point. We'll see what happens with that. An unfortunate aspect of it, though, is that the front runner would be probably his vice president, J.D. Vance, whose open embrace of the AfD in Germany sends a lot of really bad signals in terms of what his underlying motivations are and the way he sees the world. It may be that Trumpism survives Trump, in which case this change could be for the foreseeable future rather than temporary.
Thank you, Deborah.
Unfortunately, I believe it will be virtually impossible to have trust in the current era, and it's going to be very difficult to restore from the standpoint of psychology. According to social psychologists, trust is hard to create and easy to lose. And partly that's because of an inherent bias in the way people infer good and bad traits. People believe that a moral person will never do anything bad, whereas an immoral person might do an occasional good deed. And so if a moral person does something bad, we infer that he's immoral. Whereas one moral act doesn't prove anything, because even Trump could do something good occasionally. Trump's humiliation and berating of Zelensky in the Oval Office, I think, was a turning point in the attitudes of U.S. allies toward the United States. Never before has a U.S. president humiliated a foreign leader in public, much less an ally. This is very shocking. And as I said, just one incident like that is enough to change people's beliefs. And once trust is lost, it becomes very difficult to restore for a couple of reasons. And one is that people tend to interpret others' behavior so that it fits their pre-existing beliefs. And so if they mistrust someone, they will interpret any sort of friendly actions or cooperative gestures as a trick, an attempt to deceive. And this was a problem during the Cold War. And here I think we might go back to the issue that Nick raised of mistrust and distrust. I would say mistrust is an inability to rely on the other, but distrust is a belief that the other is out to get you, will harm you. And, we're heading now to that distrust area of the continuum. And not only is it difficult to overcome because of the confirmation bias, but numerous experiments showed that mistrust is a self-fulfilling prophecy. That when people when two people mistrust each other, they will act towards the other in such a way as to confirm their beliefs that they don't trust the other. Experiments show that when someone treats someone as if he's stupid or untrustworthy, that person will behave in a hostile way and sort of confirm the original beliefs, even if they were mistaken. There's also the fact that trust will not be restored because other countries are going to form their own cooperative security institutions and trading relationships, which means that there will be no opportunity for the U.S. to prove that it can be trusted. The EU, the UK, and Canada are already increasing their security cooperation because they can't rely on the United States. Poland, South Korea, and even Japan are thinking about acquiring nuclear weapons. So, once other countries have built up relationships, not including the US, it's going to be very difficult for the US to get back in. The US-led world order was built 75 years ago on 3 pillars: mutual defense treaties, trade, and reliance on the US dollar. And now each of these pillars is being undermined by the Trump administration policies. So I'm not quite as hopeful as Andy about the possibilities of restoring trust, even if a Democrat is elected president or the Democrats can get control of Congress, so long as there are the conditions that created Trumpism in the first place, namely inequality and lack of good jobs. And it seems to me that those domestic conditions need to be addressed in order to restore trust. Because if they're not, then as Andy said, Vance could always be elected, or even Don Jr.
Thank you so much. Nick, do you share Andrew's more optimistic or Deborah's more pessimistic view in terms of whether it is possible to reestablish trust in the future?
Well, I think Andy's point was that maybe trust would be very hard to maintain and rebuild between the US and the Europeans, but maybe the Europeans, and possibly with Canada, would deepen their trust together kind of in response to that. I think that was kind of, you were offering that possibility. I mean, I think it's really quite hard to get, I'm finding it quite hard to get my head around just what is happening at the moment, in the sense that we seem to be seeing the fundamental erosion of the transatlantic security community that we've known all these decades. I mean, the way they were talking about Europe in that signal group is something that I think it would be extremely hard to find historical precedents for. And the idea that security is no longer seen as indivisible between Europe and the United States, which seems to be where we've arrived at with the current administration. And there is that fundamental question about whether in the end there could be the electoral cycle could deliver something very different. But I'm more of the view that the problem is not just Trump, it's Trumpism. And I think your point you make, Deborah, about that requiring a more broader domestic change in the US is a really important one. So if that is the case, and I think the other point that's really important that you made, Debbie, is around the nuclear proliferation point, because if we're seeing, as I think increasingly a number of European governments are starting to kind of think that they're beginning to see the end of US extended nuclear deterrence, if there really is an uncertainty around that in a way that is even more profound. I mean, there's been arguments about US extended deterrence since the beginning of the nuclear age. But if this is a profound shock beyond anything that's been experienced before in European thinking about where they stand with what is happening in Ukraine and with the US-Russian relationship being such a complicated one, then it's very hard to see how the logic of nuclear proliferation can be stopped in the longer term. And I think it's not just that the European alliances are being shaken up, of course, it's also the Asian ones. And so the question then is, what does the world, you come back to, you started at Sandy this morning with Ken Waltz. And, I mean, you can ask the question whether more nuclear armed states will be better. Waltz was obviously of the view that more may be better. I think most of us think that's not the case. And what are the possibilities for trust to flourish in a world where nuclear weapons are spreading to an increasing number of states? I think that's a profoundly unsettling prospect, and one that we really need to think hard about how we can contain that, and what we can do about it. I mean, I think the broader question, coming back to what I was saying before, is that, and I think this picks up something Vincent was saying as well, which is that the critical point about trust is that you can only flourish in a situation where both sides believe and act on the basis of the other's trustworthiness. And in the end, as the moral philosopher Honora O'Neill has put it, we must only trust the trustworthy. And the challenge is to try and ascertain whether the people that we're dealing with are potentially trustworthy if we act in the right way, or whether actually they're very untrustworthy and we need to respond accordingly. And I think that that problem of signaling type, which is again where you started this, Andy, that remains profoundly the challenge. I think that in a condition of international anarchy, how do states that have peaceful defensive intentions signal that to each other in conditions where they believe that the other is out to do them harm? And it may be that they think that the others are out to do them harm because they've misperceived their intentions. But how do you get over that signaling problem where you can test out whether the other does have peaceful defensive intentions towards you, but also communicate your own in such a way that you don't expose yourself to danger and risk? And I think that fundamental question, which is what you set out, I think, to try and explore and answer in the book 20 years ago, Andy, remains a really powerful one. Because if, as I was suggesting earlier, distrust is where we're increasingly finding ourselves. The question is whether that distrust is based on misplaced psychological dynamics, coming back to Jervis, that ultimately it's about misperceptions. If only we properly could communicate, we'd realize that actually we can have a relationship of trust, or whether the distrust is actually the right thing to do. We needed more distrust in the 1930s, not less. The question today is, how do we think about that balance in relation to, the major adversarial relationships of the day? Thanks.
Thank you, Nick. Vincent, how much of a pessimist are you in terms of the future of trust and I don't know, potentially the reestablishment of trust in the future?
Yeah, so I'll give you a very academic answer to that and say it depends on what you mean by trust. And of course, I think it's an important discussion here because, of course, I think to a certain extent, we've been implicitly talking of a general sense of trust. So does the United States trust Canada? Does Canada trust the United States? Which is sort of thinking about like the character, the overall character. Sometimes I think that's a helpful way of thinking about it. Another way, of course, to think about it is through an idea of what exactly is being entrusted in any particular relationship, and do those things have to be universal? I think, again, in terms of the global shocks that we're going through, in terms of the rise of authoritarian and populist and far right states, it's easy to see how we might have trouble trusting in the future because, again, they seem pretty alien to us, and that alienation that we face from them makes it more difficult for us to trust them, and probably the other way around given the discourse that they have about the liberals. So I think basically, in the short term, we'll see a fracturing of any type of, if there was any type of global generalized trust that existed. I mean, we're now seeing that fractured based on an assumed intention to harm, based on these ideological and political cleavages that we see arising around the world. And I think, one of the things we need to think about is, where and when, and maybe when is, of course, very important here. When can you have opportunistic trust building? At some point during a shocking, transition period, it's very difficult to then take stock, figure out what's going on, and then think about how can we engage in trust building. There might here be historical analogies with the end of the Cold War, and this is perhaps getting back to Andrew Kidd's book. But of course, very different political circumstances. I also think that the part of what we need to consider is really the normativity of trust when we ask these questions. So I think, of course, when we talk about, can trust endure, we are almost certainly talking about, among good liberal values, preferably among good liberal states. Because, of course, the fact that, and getting back to the Cold War, we as liberals won that war. And of course, that sort of goes into our trust building narratives. But of course, if trust between world leaders had led to a communist authoritarian world, maybe we would see things a little bit differently.
Yes, that's a very good point, Vincent. So my last question before we transition into the Q&A, and I'm really happy to see a number of questions already there for us to tackle. So my last question is a little bit of a reflection of of the link between academia and being relevant for politics. And basically, what do you think us trust researchers should focus on in the future? What areas we should research to remain relevant for international political developments? Andrew?
Okay, I'm a little bit unsure how to answer this. I mean, I think trust and mistrust are always going to be of importance. Like if you're talking about how should we like bridge the gap or interact with, you know, policy journalists or things like that, I think it's always going to be an important topic, you know, more or less as it is. So maybe I'll just make 2 points in terms of things that I think need to be, well, one thing that should be borne in mind and one thing that might be worthwhile subject to research. So one thing to be borne in mind, one of my points in the book, sort of going back to a point that Ken Oy made in his book on cooperation, is you can't build trust with the untrustworthy. So if you have untrustworthy actors, you can't build trust. And the problem isn't mistrust at that point. It's the untrustworthiness of the actors. And there's plenty of untrustworthy actors in the world. So if you have a world or a set or a collection or a pair of untrustworthy actors, the problem isn't that they don't trust each other. That's a correct perception. And the problem is the untrustworthiness of the actor. So it's important, I think, not to sort of beat your head against the wall or sort of like naively think the problem is mistrust and perceptions, but the problem could be much more fundamental than that. In terms of like research agenda, so I'm involved in this project now with Sumit Ganguly on U.S.-Indian trust relationships, and so I've been thinking sort of more generally about trust and trustworthiness. And one thing that I didn't really do in the book, but this has sort of encouraged me to think about, is what are the sources of trustworthiness in a more sort of general framework, right? I mean, to me, in the book, I'm just sort of taking it as preferences in a game that are just sort of there written down as numbers or variables. But what are the sources of trustworthiness, more broadly speaking? And you can think of interests, you can think of desire for reputation, either for honesty or for you know, moderate intentions, which can smooth out international cooperation and make it possible to cooperate more. But then something that Vincent touched on is like moral aspects or normativity, right? A lot of, I think, ordinary language understanding of trust is some sort of notion that this fiduciary notion or something along the lines of, I trust them, they're a decent person, right? They're not the kind of person who's going to stab me in the back. And that's kind of a moral, it's a belief about the moral constraint that someone faces, that they're just not the kind of person who would do that, not just to me necessarily, but to anyone, and then possibly specifically to me. And that, I think, is an interesting question. I think a lot of people have that view that to trust someone is to think that they're a decent person in some way, that they have some sort of moral constraints, that they're not just, you know, vicious or killers who are, you know, only constrained by the law or, you know, fear of retaliation. And that, as a general source of trustworthiness, could be sticky, could be, I think, underlying this notion that trust is very easy to lose and hard to build, because you're not really sure, do they have that or not? Are they just pretending? Are they psychopaths? So, and then like you see them murder someone and they say, oh wow, I didn't realize that, but they're really evil. And that blows away any number of, you know, good things that they did in public, you know, where powerful people are around. So I think that kind of moral constraint, it's not something I talked about in the book at all, but could be interfaced with it. I think needs to be thought of more carefully as a research agenda.
Thank you. Deborah?
Going back to the domestic problem that I mentioned earlier, I think there could be some research on how to recreate a domestic consensus in favor of international cooperation in the United States. I mean, what we need to think about arguments that would be persuasive to the American public to show that it really is in their interest to have free trade and to have peace in Europe and Asia, and that U.S. investments are worthwhile, that we're not just being taken advantage of. And during the Cold War, there was the Soviet boogeyman, you know, that was able to get a consensus through fear. And so now I think academics need to do a better job of selling international cooperation and trust. in terms of practical policy suggestions, U.S. research suggests that you have to do something costly and credible in order to change beliefs. So is there anything that a U.S. president could do? Say, let's say there's more of a support for cooperation in the United States. Is there anything a U.S. president could do to prove that the U.S. can be trusted again? And what would that be? And I was thinking like maybe admitting Ukraine to NATO, or in the worst case analysis, let's say China invades Taiwan and the United States would defend Taiwan, although I certainly hope that doesn't happen. Another practical issue is, trust has to be built up over time. And in the private sector, trust is often based on a profitable relationship between two parties, where they will lose the benefits of the relationship if they betray the other. So even someone like Trump might be persuaded to cooperate on the margins if he thinks he can gain by it, he or she can gain by it. So what would be some activities that the U.S. could get involved with, say, Europe or Asian countries, that might show that there's a benefit to cooperation? Like maybe something like the Ukraine-U.S. mineral deal, if it's not entirely exploitative, might be a model. And that might convince someone more transactional like Trump.
Thank you so much, Nick.
So I took the question kind of more as a sort of what should trust research kind of look like in the next 25 years or 20 years? And I guess taking a cue from where we started in Aberystwyth, Vincent and I and Jan, as Vincent said, when we first set up the trust research group there, and then kind of it migrated online during the pandemic. The kind of fundamental motivating sort of interest was, what can we learn about trust from other disciplines? Because one of the striking things, about trust research has been that those outside of international relations who've done an enormous amount on trust research have spent very little time actually engaging international relations people that have worked on trust. And there's at the same time though, international relations people that have worked on trust haven't perhaps historically engaged as much as they could have done with people outside of international relations. So one of the things we were interested in trying to do was to widen the conversation and kind of open that up. Although I think, Debbie, certainly, your book, does engage other disciplines, and you've talked, eloquently about psychology, the psychological approaches this afternoon. But I think in general, there was a wider amount of work going on outside of international relations than international relations people would perhaps, engaged with. And at the same time, though, I think what struck us was just how little non-international relations trust research people actually focused on the international. And yet the international is the greatest test of trust that you can have, particularly in the adversarial realm. And yet all these people in these other disciplines were not actually looking at that at all. And that actually carries on, I think, right through to the present day. There were some exceptions, and a lot of those people were kind of part of the wider network that Dave and Esther are now leading. But in general, I think that's a problem. So the plea for more interdisciplinarity would be a big one for me, that we need to bring together psychologists, anthropologists, historians, and international relations theorists working in this space to see whether what the possibilities are for a conversation and for what that might mean in terms of practical public policy kind of applications. So I think, the contribution of psychology, management, business, history, ethics to thinking about trust would be really important. I think in terms of key areas, the one that you alluded to, Andy, and in the project that you're working on with Sumit, the distinction between trust and trustworthiness. I mean, one of the most widely cited papers in trust research is the Mayer et al. Paper on trustworthiness, where they develop, the ABI model of ability, benevolence, and integrity. And that's been a very important kind of source of engagement and research over the years in management and business. And I think some of the arguments around trustworthiness outside of IR are certainly ones that we could explore, but also making that distinction just much sharper between trust and trustworthiness. And Dave had a nice piece in The Conversation recently, if anyone wants to follow that up a bit, where he explored some of that further. I think the other one is the relationship between empathy and trust. We talk a lot about empathy and trust. What are the causal relationships in between those two key ideas? How do they relate to one another? I think there's still a lot of space for work there. The other one that we slide over all the time is the relationship between trust and confidence. I still don't have a really good answer to that question, to be honest. And I think it's a really important one, particularly in a field where we talk a lot about confidence and security building measures, where we talk about, diplomatic communiques endlessly talk about the importance of building trust and confidence. And it's always trust and confidence paired together. But analytically, there are really important distinctions between those ideas. Vincent's written a very important paper with Jan Bruzicka on that, which I would encourage people to look at in the Review of International Studies a few years ago. And it's a very important contribution to that debate, but there's more work there. And then finally, I would say vulnerability. Vulnerability is at the core of trust. All the definitions outside of IR talk about the willingness to be vulnerable. But what does vulnerability mean, really? And how is it experienced? And who are the actors that are experiencing it? And is vulnerability experienced as troubling and anxiety-provoking? Or is it actually experienced as something that people can live with comfortably because of the trust? So that comes back to the question of, very high trusting relationships, that idea I've explored, this idea of trust as suspension, that depends upon an assumption that you're extremely vulnerable, but you're not uncomfortable with the vulnerability because you believe the trust is deep. Although, coming back to your point, Andy, there's always the possibility that you can be betrayed. So there's no objective kind of security in that, but different perceptions of vulnerability and how people experience vulnerability internationally, I think would be really important research. Thanks.
Thank you, Vincent.
Yeah, so I'll be short since I can see we got to leave some time for questions. So I think there's a couple of things. I think Nick has alluded to the different elements of trust still need to be explored. I mean, he mentioned vulnerability, emotions, and emotional states, empathy, all of that, still there's more to be thought of. So basically relating trust to close concepts and seeing where the connections are. More empirically, I mean, looking at what we have right here, I think there's a big question, coming out of 40 years of the American-led liberal world order, about exactly on what basis is trust going to be formed or distrust formed in the new and ever-changing constellation of states that we have. So to what extent will those with similar worldviews, and again, whatever that means, will cluster together because they see each other as sort of normative partners and therein as sort of more trustworthy because their normative values reflect each other. I think this is particularly the case. We talk a lot about liberal states and, trusting or not trusting either other liberal states or illiberal states. Is there something about the new populist right and far right that we can think about them trusting each other? And are there certain dynamics to that need to be considered? And then finally, we might want to think about ourselves and basically how it is that we think about trust in our constant anxiety about liberal futures, and whether or not that poses certain problems in the sense that if we see the world as increasingly unrecognizable ourselves as researchers, whether then we miss the potential to think about trust exactly because we ourselves are affected by the uncertainty and therefore how it is that we perceive the trust that we want to study.
Thank you, Vincent. So I think it's time for the Q&A. David, do you have any questions for us?
Yeah, great. We've got quite a few coming in. Some contemporary event-oriented ones, but we've covered that quite a bit, so we'll park those for a moment and jump back a little bit. So there's a question here about how does emotion connect to sort of the work that you do. Now, for those who are not familiar with trust research, the panel here spans a typology that Vincent and Jan talked about a number of years ago across rational calculation, psychology, and sort of social constructivism. So you can kind of the speakers can kind of talk from that background for this question. But is emotion important to your theory and concept of trust? What role does emotion play exactly in your approach? So that was to everybody in the panel.
Well, I'll just say, like, so far in my approach, it doesn't. But I'm increasingly thinking that might be a lacuna that needs to be addressed in some way. I'm still not quite sure how I would think of it, but I think it would have something to do with normative constraint, essentially. That if you have emotions, talking about people, if you think that somebody would have an emotional reaction to a breach of trust, that they would feel bad about that in some sense, then that's a foundation for trustworthiness that could be perceived by others. And so, and it also could connect with identity. If you think that people share beliefs or share desire that people in their identity group do well, that could be a foundation for trust as well.
Is there anybody else who'd like to respond?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't put my hand up. So yeah, I mean, emotion plays a really important part in my work. I mean, in my new book with Marcus Holmes that hopefully we're about to submit to Oxford University Press, emotional, a theory of what explains positive and negative emotional encounters drives the book. And in particular, we focus on what we see as a distinct level of analysis in international relations from the individual and the other levels, which is the interpersonal. I mean, I kind of argued that the importance of the interpersonal in my 2018 book, Trusting Enemies. In the new book, we try to build a theory using Randall Collins's theories in and other theories in microsociology of the conditions under which positive emotional energy is generated in interpersonal encounters between state leaders. So emotion has a critical role to play there. And we look, following Collins's argument, we develop a theory of social bonding in diplomacy. And we look at the importance of mutual focus of attention and shared mood in generating positive emotional encounters. And we try to give empirical indicators for the presence or absence of those in the cases that we look at. So I think emotion has become a more important thing. In my other work on nuclear crises, just in a paper, Marcus and I, on emotional dynamics of nuclear crises, looking at the interpersonal and how the interpersonal can be really important in opening up spaces for empathy and even trust under the nuclear shadow, using in particular, we wrote an article a couple of years ago on the case of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we've developed that in this chapter further to build a theory of what we see as the emotional dynamics that can open up in nuclear crises. So historically, a lot of work on nuclear crises saw emotions as being leading to irrational behavior, and you can see that in some of the contemporary scholarship still. The idea that these emotions might generate highly escalatory outcomes. We challenge that conventional wisdom in the literature and argue that emotional dynamics sometimes can produce shared security dilemma sensibility and trust. So yeah, I think emotions for me plays a really important role in my work, and I think it's going to become a more prominent one. And I would pick up Andy and Vincent's point about the importance of studying this idea of moral restraint, because trust is not just about can we trust others, but can we trust ourselves? And I think the question of whether when people get tempted, whether it's, the possibility of making political gains at the expense of an opponent, taking territory. The case study I looked at, in my previous book, the India-Pakistan case in relation to the collapse of the Lahore peace process and the Kargil war, arguably the Pakistani leader was tempted by the possibility of being the first Pakistan leader to recover territory from the Indians, and that led him to break his trust with the Indian leader Atal Bihari Vajpayee. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Could I just remind the panelists that if they want to answer a question, please raise your hand so that I know whom I should call on. Deborah?
Yes, I've discovered the importance of emotions in historical research on trust. If trust were purely irrational, it would be a matter of expectations. And when the other side betrays your trust, you would just lower your probability that you can cooperate with him in the future. But that's not how leaders react. Khrushchev was extremely emotional and upset when the U-2 was shot down over the Soviet Union 2 weeks before the Paris summit. And he kept saying over and over again, Eisenhower, Eisenhower, my friend, my friend. He betrayed me. He was extremely angry. He didn't just lower his expectations. He was angry because he had been betrayed by a friend. And another example would be Kennedy. So, Kennedy, when Khrushchev put missiles in Cuba, he said, he can't do that to me. And he was extremely emotional. It wasn't just the security threat. He felt that, that Khrushchev had looked down on him by doing something so provocative. So I think there's lots of examples where leaders react emotionally to betrayal of trust. So trust isn't just a matter of beliefs and expectations. It's also a question of emotions.
Thank you, Vincent.
Yeah, and just to echo that point, a friend of mine, Lucy Abbott, who's at Edinburgh, and I wrote a piece a couple of years ago in EJIR that exactly discusses the concept of entrusted norms, which of course, and one of the distinctions that we make is exactly the emotional nature of them, echoing a lot of what Deborah just said, that what happens is when you betray a norm that happens to be not just internalized, but entrusted between people, that it creates a reaction of not just disappointment, but betrayal, which means that, of course, you can't just return to the political status quo by returning to the behavioral status quo, just going back to how you acted before. The other thing I'd like to sort of mention is that there's another paper that I have with Marie Robin, who is at Leiden, and it's under review right now, but it's basically on how trust isn't an emotion. Trying to make a clarification on that trust is highly related to emotions in many ways, but why it might not be considered an emotion unto itself.
Thank you. David, do we have any more questions?
Yeah. So kind of moving on from that. So obviously theory is really quite important, but empirics obviously also quite important in connecting those two. So one of the questions sort of exploring that methodological aspect was, okay, what methodological approaches do you believe best enable both, one, the direct comparison in levels of trust between actors, and two, the correlation of levels of trust with endogenous characteristics of the actors themselves?
Well, I mean, I'll take a stab at it. Perhaps unsurprisingly, my answer is that game theory works pretty well for that. The great thing about game theory is that it sets it in a formal setting, which is broad and portable across all kinds of different issue domains, whether it's international relations or economics or interpersonal relations or domestic politics. So it's a broad framework that spans these different areas. It doesn't get everything, obviously, and I think there are these aspects that it doesn't cover, but it provides a framework on which you can sort of hang all those other things to some extent. So in that way, I think it's very helpful in that regard. I think there's a lot of research. I mean, as Debbie had pointed out, in psychology, her work has been heavily, bringing a lot of those insights to international relations for many years, which is great. And thinking about it in terms of the normative constraints as well. So there's more psychological stuff to be done there, but yeah, from my mind, the game theory perspective is a good overall framework.
Nick?
Yeah, I mean, I'd make two points. I think, first of all, I think it's really important to draw attention, as the questioner does, to the levels question, because I think one of the things that we do in trust research, and I'm certainly guilty of this, is that we move between the different levels in the way that we write about trust. And even when we try not to, even when we sort of start out with the discipline of trying to focus on one particular level, it's quite difficult to maintain that. And so I think we need to be more explicit about when we're thinking about our methodological approach to trust, we need to think really hard about the levels and how we see the relationship between the levels. So I talked about the importance, of the interpersonal, but obviously the interpersonal, can't be analyzed outside of the ideational and the material and the wider structural forces. And so good theory and good empirical work is going to be trying to embrace the multiplicity of levels that are at work, but that's hard to do. But that doesn't mean it's not important. I mean, in terms of my own approach and the approach that you know I've taken in my work and the work that Marcus and I have done together, it's very much a sort of small n, qualitative, highly interpretivist, social constructivist kind of approach to try to recover the intersubjective understandings and beliefs of the actors themselves, and crucially to try to study the process of social interaction, to try to look at the beliefs that actors had before they encountered each other, what happened when they were in the room together, when they met, and then kind of what were the consequences of that. So to try to look at to what extent then perceptions of whether actors were exercising security dilemma sensibility, this concept that I've been using for a long time, this idea that the other party you believe might be open to cooperation, and so on. So I think methodologically, it's important to be explicit about the assumptions that you're making, and it doesn't mean that that methodological approach is necessarily a better one than others. You know, I think you get to see different things. I think, you know, Andy's approach opens up very important ways, as I said, of thinking about these questions. But perhaps you need to then try and think about how we can combine these different approaches, and can they be combined, and what do you get if you do that? And, you know, it's interesting, Andy, you saying that maybe you think, you know, you'd like to open up more the space of the emotional in your work. What would that start to look like? How would that then relate to the kind of the formal theory? Is kind of interesting, I think, to reflect upon. And equally, you know, what would happen if you did a large end study of some of the things that I've been working on, which, you know, I haven't done, but Marcus and I have talked about the possibility of doing those kind of things. So I think eclecticism, being open to the importance of what each methodological approach can bring, recognizing the limitations of the methodological approaches that we adopt potentially is an important way forward as social scientists.
Thank you, Nick. I'm very conscious that we have only about 10 minutes left. So I think what I'll do is that the next question will be the last question. So Dave, what is the last question that we'd like the panelists to answer?
Okay, well, given that we've covered quite a lot of negative and we've talked about sort of past and contemporary, maybe think about the future. So a couple of questions sort of put up about the restoring of trust. So is there a pathway to restoring trust between US and Western allies in the short, longer run? We might also want to expand that to thinking about how we might restore some sort of trusting relationships with maybe current or adversaries as well, to kind of broaden that out.
Is there anyone who'd like to take this question? Yeah. Deborah?
What I mentioned earlier, thinking about some cooperative enterprises that we could enter into with our allies and friends, you know, things, maybe development of new weapon systems, or highly, you know, ways of constraining AI, or ways of enhancing control of drugs, just something that we can do with other states to show that we can cooperate with them. And also the willingness of US leaders to put US assets on the line to show that we're willing to accept some risk of losses, I think would be one way of rebuilding trust and just consistency over time. But I think we need to, I think maybe the current trade war is going to impress on many people the importance of international cooperation, and that there will be more there will be more support for free trade when people go to Walmart at Christmas time and there's no toys for their kids.
Thank you. Indeed, I've always been surprised about all this trade war issue, because the world is so interconnected and production is so basically interdependent. So is security, for that matter, that it's really, really hard to to just, go it alone and not necessarily have anybody's trust. But obviously, that's not the opinion of the current leadership. Is there anybody else who would like to respond to this question?
Is it okay if I just go? I had my hand up, so
Yes.
yeah. So I think the possibility of rebuilding trust. I mean, obviously, a lot of people are thinking about Trump and the United States. I wonder to the extent to which the problem right now is really we don't know, and when I say we, I'm saying the rest of us don't really know what the United States is anymore. And our concept of what the United States is has been in a way shaken, which of course yields a lot of uncertainty. And in a way, whether even if, let's pretend this continues, that we have J.D. Vance and then it kind of continues along in the way that things do, that this is some sort of more permanent shift that stabilizes somewhere. Whether or not the stabilization, even under conditions of animosity, is actually better for the potential trust building, because at least we have an idea of what we're dealing with. And whether or not the sheer uncertainty over exactly what the United States is and what it's likely to be in the future will hamper any sort of intentions, because we don't know where or how or what to build trust on, because we don't really have a good sense of what the United States is anymore.
So, I mean, I'd come back to the question that I don't think we can build trust in relationships if they're characterized by deep distrust. And I think Andy was right 7 years ago to say, the challenge is to get us from deep distrust to moderate distrust and then to neutrality, because that greatly reduces, this are his words, the risk of war. And, you went on to say, Andy, getting from there to deep trust is nice, but not necessary to avoid nuclear devastation. And I think, given that nuclear risks are amplifying and multiplying, and we alluded to that a little bit earlier, the challenge has to be to think about how we can reduce distrust. When the Secretary General opened the 2021 NPT review conference, the UN Secretary General, he said, the challenge is to replace distrust with dialogue. But the problem is, as we've alluded to, dialogue is only possible with people who genuinely want a dialogue. And what we've got to do is test out whether people do want a dialogue. Try and find ways and think about the signaling mechanisms, the reassurance, the costly signals, the face-to-face diplomacy, the panoply of things that we've worked on and explored in the field of international relations over the decades as part of trying to think about the whole challenge of reassurance, to see whether those devices help us to test out whether others are open to cooperation. And I think your point, Debbie, about finding, common ground, shared fate issues, AI, climate change, and so on. These are important, potential markers for taking that conversation forward. But in the end, if we discover or we believe that others are not committed to cooperation and dialogue, then then, as Andy said, it's really not possible to build trust. And actually, trust would actually become dangerously misguided at that point, and to be too trusting could be very costly. So my kind of, I guess my closing here would be to say that what we really need to do, and this is kind of where you started this, Andy, is we really need to test out whether these relationships are ones that are characterized by Jervis's spiral model, where if we have a better understanding of the spiral model and we understand that we're locked in it, we might be able to find a way of find a pathway to mutual security. Or if we really believe that we're not in a spiral model situation, but in what he called the deterrence model, then we have to respond very differently. And the space for trust then will be very limited in those relationships. Thanks, this has been great.
Thank you so much. So we've come to the end of our hour and a half. And the only thing left for me to do at this point is to thank everyone who spent the last 90 minutes with us. We are especially grateful for the insightful comments of the panelists, and we would also like to acknowledge the ISA virtual team that has done a wonderful job in supporting this event. So thank you everybody for joining us today. Goodbye.